Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video on a channel called Kirk Cameron on TBN. TBN, for those unfamiliar, is the Trinity Broadcasting Network, the largest religious TV network in the world. And, being a large Christian organization, you can bet your ass that as soon as I googled them for some background, one of the first things I found was lawsuits related to sex scandals. Yay! But that's not what I'm here for today. That was just a disappointing yet unsurprising find while doing my usual background research. Besides, for a Christian organization, they're not that bad anyway. Only one involved a minor, and the employee responsible was fired. The lawsuit was about the fact that they covered it up rather than reporting it to the police. Ain't it always? But in this case, the victim was the owner's granddaughter. The reputation of the network was apparently more important to him than his own granddaughter. Anyway, this is a video on the resurrection of Jesus, featuring none other than Sean McDowell, the apologist whose hairstyle seems to have been inspired by the equatorial ridge on Iapetus. So let's see if this will finally be the video that convinces me that Jesus came back from the dead.
Let's get to the heart of this conversation. There is a sighting, a Jesus sighting that happened about 2,000 years ago.
Ah yes, Kirk Cameron, the actor who could have been most well known for his role on Growing Pains in the 80s, but went off the deep end of Christian cinema and is now known for being either Ray Comfort's sidekick, or the guy who smashes his porn computer in Fireproof. Honestly, he's probably just happy that you forgot about his starring role in the 1991 movie called A Little Piece of Heaven, where he played a guy who kidnapped orphans and then gaslit them into thinking that they were dead and had gone to heaven, and that heaven was working as de facto slaves on his pig farm. Here's a clip of him drugging his first victim.
You're black. It's fine that you're black.
Fucking yikes, man. Again though, this is irrelevant to the rest of the video, but Kirk doesn't really do much in this one, and as a lover of movies that are absolute garbage, I couldn't not bring that one up.
And they say the tomb is empty. What evidence do we have today that gives us confidence that the resurrection is a historical fact?
Well, there's really nothing that I've seen. Like, almost literally. There's a handful of stories written down by non-eyewitnesses several decades after the events allegedly happened, Paul writing down a creed that makes the claim that a bunch of people saw the resurrected Jesus, and a small handful of non-Christians who wrote brief summaries of things that Christians believed. When you take all of the sophistry and apologetics out of it, that is its core. And while I'm sure this would be considered an uncharitable summary of the evidence, it is an accurate one. And when said that way, I hope you can see why so many people find the evidence to be unbelievable.
So there's at least 20 to 21 arguments for the empty tomb that cumulatively make a powerful case.
And yet, despite that, somehow apologists only ever regurgitate the same 3 or 4 arguments, usually while doing what Sean is doing here and alluding to the existence of other arguments, leaving the uncritical viewer with the impression that the cumulative case must be quite impressive indeed.
One of the most compelling is in regards to who discovered the empty tomb. Now, all 4 Gospels report that women discovered the empty tomb.
Ugh, this again. Really, if this is one of the most compelling arguments you've got, then the cumulative case is a lost cause, with the side bonus of you missing one of the biggest focuses of Jesus' ministry, assuming his ministry was accurately documented in the Gospels, which is not a given.
We read that in our modern culture, and we don't think twice about it. But in that patriarchal culture, a woman was typically not educated the same way as a man.
And of course, we all know that it takes a very highly educated individual to see that an empty tomb is indeed empty. Uneducated people see dead bodies in empty tombs all the time. It's one of the most well-known side effects of being a high school dropout, after all.
Common knowledge, really.
In fact, there's some ancient Jewish proverbs, not in the scriptures, that says, better the words of the law burnt than delivered to women. They were looked down upon.
And there are Christian scriptures that say that it's shameful for a woman to speak in church, that a woman should keep silent, that women should not have authority over men, that they should be submissive to their husbands. Misogyny is a thing in the Abrahamic religions. This is not controversial, though a lot of Christian apologists pretend like it's not true, saying that it's just different roles, but everyone is still equal, except one of those roles is literally to be in submission to the other role. That is definitionally not equal, because that's not how those words work.
And so put yourself in the position of the gospel writers. If they're inventing a story of an empty tomb, and they want to convince people that this is true, who are the least likely witnesses they would invent, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to be persuasive?
Tell me you don't know the atheist arguments without saying you don't know the atheist arguments. I don't know of anyone who thinks that it was the people writing the Gospels who made up the stories whole cloth. Now, certainly they probably did add or subtract some aspects of the stories, but they were writing down stories that were known mostly through oral tradition in their communities. But also notice the way he said that. Whether intentional or unintentional, he's made it sound as though the atheist argument is that all four of the gospel authors were making everything up whole cloth, completely independent from one another. There are a few reasons why I could guess that an apologist would want to make it sound that way, and none of them make Sean look good here, because I know he knows better than that. First is to strawman the atheist for the more sophisticated layperson, the ones who have read a few apologetics books or have at least watched some apologetics on YouTube, not the people who have done a deep dive, but the ones who are at least passingly familiar with how the Gospels came to be. Those people will hear that and think, silly atheists, they don't even know enough about Christianity to know that the Synoptics at the very least shared a common source for a good chunk of their material. Second, to placate the less sophisticated layperson, the person who will stumble upon a show like this once in a while watching their Christian TV network, but doesn't really follow the arguments, the kind of Christian most likely to believe that the Gospels were written by four guys named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that those four guys were actual disciples of Jesus. I mean, maybe they know enough to say that Luke was a physician that accompanied Paul, but maybe they don't. So phrasing things like that can give the already believing Christian a false sense of how strong the evidence for Christianity is. It can give atheists something to point at to show how even professional apologists don't seem to understand either the atheist arguments or their own, and it can also give the curious Christian severe doubts. Because a curious Christian might hear that and think that it means what you said, and then when they find out that you were subtly misrepresenting the evidence, it will cause them to look deeper to find out what else you might have been misrepresenting. And once you've seen through the patina of credibility that apologists cover themselves with, you start to realize just how weak the evidence really is. And the fact that they're willing to engage in this sort of subtle misrepresentation in order to make the case look stronger than it is itself a demonstration of how weak the case is.
And the answer is they obviously wouldn't invent women. That would be counterproductive.
Why would it be counterproductive? Like, yeah, women were seen as lesser in that society, but that doesn't mean that they didn't exist or play important narrative roles. Hell, the whole book of Esther is about a woman who used clever political maneuvering to save all of the Jews from extermination. A woman was the literal savior of the Jews in that story. That's a bit more important of a role than found an empty hole and then told the men about it so they could verify it for themselves, is it not? Now, I'm not going to pretend that this means that the Bible promotes gender equality. There are only about 200 named women in the Bible compared to the nearly 1,200 named men, and the majority of the named women are given names in relation to a man. So for every one named woman, there are 6 named men. So clearly the people who wrote it didn't think that women were as important as men. My point is that there is precedent in the Jewish scriptures for having women play important roles. And as far as important roles go, discovering the empty tomb and then having a bunch of men verify that discovery is relatively minor. And that's without even getting into the fact that this entire argument relies on you missing one of the key aspects of Jesus' whole ministry, according to the Gospels at least. Jesus actively targeted marginalized groups in society. He hung out with the lepers, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, and all the other sinners. People that the religious leaders of the time looked down upon with scorn, thinking them unworthy of God's mercy. He regularly battled wits with the prominent and respectable religious leaders, evading their rhetorical traps and often while catching them in his own, and always coming down on the side of showing compassion or forgiveness to the downtrodden. At the time of the resurrection, the disciples would have been seen as the leaders of the new religious movement, the people who were the closest to his central figure. They would be the most highly respected Christians. So for Jesus to choose to shun them in his first appearance in favor of people from a marginalized group is in perfect alignment with the gospel message. Why would an author who has spent the entire book up to this point building Jesus up as the kind of guy who isn't afraid or ashamed of hanging out with the outcast members of society suddenly be embarrassed that Jesus appeared to people who are in a class that is generally looked down upon in society?
So the reason they report women, the most likely reason, is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John heard a story that they believe, and they're passing on what they think is true.
Oh, wow. That is like the worst version of that apologetic that you could have possibly gone with. If I grant everything you said thus far, what that gets us to is that the authors of the Gospels believed the things that they were writing. That is entirely possible. I'd even argue that it's more than possible. It's plausible. Now, if only we had a word for when someone is passing on information that they think is true, but it's not wrong. The word is wrong.
So that's one reason that it's kind of called the criterion of embarrassment.
It's only kind of called that because it's only kind of a criterion. It's one that is very rarely used outside of Christian scholars engaging in apologetics because, to be frank, it's not a very good one. It's got plenty of issues, not the least of which is that in order to apply it, you have to actually know what the author of a text would consider to be an embarrassing detail in the first place. The same detail could be considered embarrassing or not in different contexts to different authors. And then when you know enough about a culture to be able to say with any amount of certainty what people in said culture would even find to be embarrassing, you still have to figure out if there were any sort of reason that the author might have included a particular embarrassing detail other than that detail being true. For instance, if an author seems to have a habit of inserting details into a story specifically to make it seem more believable, it could be that an embarrassing detail would be inserted into the story specifically to serve the function that it still serves for modern apologists today, as an apologetic. So if you have an author, like whoever wrote Matthew, including a detail about a guard at the tomb and then explicitly tying that detail in as an explanation for how we know the body wasn't stolen, who then goes on to include a detail that you think he would find embarrassing, but also you think that the inclusion of that detail gives the story more credibility, then why would we not just operate under the assumption that it was included in the story to increase the credibility of the story?
That people don't invent material to intentionally embarrass themselves and disparage their message. So when writers include that, it's because they care more about truth than the perception.
Jesus raising the status of marginalized people was one of the key messages of the Gospels, so having him do that for women at his resurrection in no way disparages the message. But even putting that aside, when a liar is constructing a lie, they will often include embarrassing details as part of the lie for the specific purpose of making it seem more plausible, to give the people they're talking to a "why would they say that if it weren't true" kind of impression. And this is one of the most basic aspects of lying that young children will often pick up on. They'll often not realize that subtlety is a part of telling a convincing lie and will just come right out and say, "Why would I have told you that if it weren't true?" So yeah, forgive me if I don't accept the story as true because it included one of the most rudimentary aspects of lying. But also, like I said earlier, I don't even think the gospel authors were themselves the ones making up the story. They were writing down the oral tradition that they were familiar with. If women at the tomb had become a well-known aspect of the story, then their books likely wouldn't have become popular in their communities if they had omitted it. And it's also generally accepted that Christianity was more appealing to the women of the time than the pagan religions, leading some sociologists to estimate that 2/3 of the early church were women. So just given the nature of how the story spread in the early church, which was possibly mostly women, the fact that women ended up featuring prominently in the story is not really surprising, and I doubt very much that the women would have considered their role to be embarrassing. And since their role was a part of the accepted story by the time quill was put to papyrus, the authors of the Gospels could not omit it. Worth mentioning at this point, though, is that in 2 of the Gospels, Mark and Luke, it is explicitly stated that the men did not believe the women when they told them about the empty tomb. And in Luke and John, it explicitly states that the men verified the tomb was empty before any appearances from Jesus. In all 4 Gospels, the main role that's given to the women is to bring a message to the men. And in Luke, Jesus' first appearance is to the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, not to the women. So as prominently as women feature in the story, they are still relegated to the role of, here, give this message to the men, with the men usually not believing them and needing to verify things for themselves. which means that if I actually take this argument seriously and assume that the women at the tomb would have been an embarrassing detail to include, then it looks like the authors of the Gospels were stuck with that aspect of the story, but inserted their own details to mitigate the embarrassment. And they each accomplished that in a slightly different way. Now, how do I know that they weren't also stuck with the mitigating details? I don't. That's entirely speculative on my part. Just like that idea that the authors would have been embarrassed by the women in the first place is.
So women discovering the empty tombs is very, very significant. There's more than this. Another one I think is interesting is that Jesus was buried in Jerusalem.
Well, at least this one is new to me. He was crucified in Jerusalem. Why would he not be buried there?
Now, what's interesting about this is if you're going to go invent a story that's not true, the hardest place to do this would be in Jerusalem.
Why would that be hard? Big cities are notorious for being places where most residents of the city just don't notice or care what's going on around them. Some guy running around in full period costume won't get a second glance from city dwellers. Seems like if you're going to set events somewhere that would make them hard to verify, it'd be a city where there's so many people that most just wouldn't be aware of whatever events you're describing anyway.
Because somebody would say, okay, wait a minute, we actually know Joseph of Arimathea. We know the name of the person who had the tomb that buried Jesus. That's pretty amazing 2,000 years later.
Okay, but do we know that this information is accurate? Do we have any non-biblical sources for any details about Joseph of Arimathea? And I don't mean all the legends that grew up around him centuries later. If you want to include those as part of his biography, then we may as well conclude the story with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, or with him having carved his last words detailing the location of the Holy Grail as being the castle.
Perhaps he was dictating. Oh, shut up.
Are there any reliable sources contemporary with the Gospels that say anything about the man? No. The earliest source we have for his existence is the Gospel of Mark, and literally the only details we have about the guy come from the 1 or 2 sentences dedicated to him in each Gospel. He was a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, a disciple of Jesus, and he was rich. Notably, as a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, he would have been present at Jesus' trial, where it was said that they all condemned him. Weird that a disciple of Jesus would have condemned him to death. Considering his first appearance happened in a book written at least 3 decades after the event, and traditionally thought to have been written in Rome, the invention of a prominent figure who did not actually exist would have been extremely difficult to fact-check. What person living in Rome is going to make the journey to Jerusalem to verify that claim? And then Matthew and Luke come next. They very obviously had access to Mark, as they both copied significant portions of Mark's narrative word for word into their own narratives. They were written about 50 years after the events they are describing, when, in all likelihood, any given member of the Sanhedrin from Jesus' time would have been long dead. And while we can't know for certain where those books were composed, Matthew is thought to have been written in Antioch, which is nearly 800 kilometers away from Jerusalem. And Luke is just Luke. I found one sketchy-looking site saying it was written in Antioch as well, but anything reputable doesn't seem to be even speculating beyond the fact that it shows evidence of being heavily influenced by Greek Hellenism. Though, to be fair, Luke also shows evidence of being more familiar with the ancient Palestine area than the other Gospel authors, doing things like avoiding referring to the Lake of Gennesaret as the Sea of Galilee, as the other Gospels do, and not even mentioning what route Jesus took to get from Tyre to the aforementioned lake, given that the route described by the other Gospels doesn't make much sense if you actually know the geography.
And his position of authority. They just go check his tomb and see if the body was there.
So, where would his tomb be? How would someone in Rome go check it? Or someone in Antioch? Or Jerusalem, for that matter? Did they have publicly accessible records detailing the locations of family tombs of all the past members of the Sanhedrin? And if they did manage to locate his tomb, assuming that he was a real guy, was it considered acceptable behavior for random people to insist on being allowed to investigate the insides of family tombs of deceased prominent council members? You make it sound like this would be the easiest thing in the world to check, but I guarantee you that I won't be allowed to start checking private family mausoleums for corpses in my neck of the woods. Maybe it was a different story in first century Judea, and anyone was allowed to waltz into any family tomb, but somehow I doubt it. Especially given the fact that stones covering the entrances of tombs in order to keep animals and grave robbers out were the norm. And that's if I grant the historicity of the tomb in the first place. That Jesus was buried in a tomb is by no means a given. The norm for crucifixion victims would be for their bodies to remain on crosses to rot, and when finally taken down, they'd be buried in simple, unmarked trench graves. Given that no story of a tomb even appears in any Christian writing until the Gospel of Mark, which remember was written at least 35 years after the fact, there is plenty of room for doubt in the empty tomb story.
But they don't. Why? Because the body's gone.
Or, more than likely, to restate a quote that I must be getting wrong because I can't find it to properly attribute it, regarding the location of Jesus' body, those who knew did not care, those who cared did not know. Shit, I'm doing the YouTube thing wrong. That's my quote. I came up with that all on my own because I'm clever. That's the YouTuber way.
So the apostles go preach the risen Jesus in Jerusalem, the very city Jesus was publicly crucified and buried in a known tomb, minimally shows incredible confidence that the tomb itself was empty.
But again, though, our sources for them doing that are written more than 3 decades after the fact and were very clearly influenced by a changing tradition as time went on. Paul writes that Jesus was buried, no mention of how he was buried, just that he was. Paul did not mention any appearance of Jesus in a way that would definitively show him to have been bodily resurrected. His own experience, as described by the book of Acts, cannot possibly have been a bodily resurrection. In both descriptions, there are men with Paul when it happens who either heard Jesus' voice but saw no one, or saw a light but heard no one. When you compare the biblical writings with each other and then line them up in the order in which they were written rather than in the order they appear in the Bible, it becomes clear that the story of Jesus was a legend that grew as time went on, with more details being added and more divinity being placed on Jesus.
That's the second one. I'll give you a third one that's quickly. It's the first explanation for the empty tomb is that the religious leaders say that the apostles stole the body. That's the explanation.
Again, though, let's give this its proper context. The Gospel of Matthew, written in the year 80 at the earliest, says that religious leaders from 50 years or so ago blamed the disciples for stealing the body as part of a polemic that he is explicitly using to respond to the accusation of body theft. It's also the only canonical document to even mention the guard at the tomb. There are a couple of apocryphal books, like the Acts of Pilate and the Gospel of Peter, that mention the guard, but as most apologists can't be found arguing for the historicity of Jesus resurrecting as a giant with a talking cross sidekick, I would hesitate to give any credence to their accounts of the guard at the tomb. So the only source that anyone considers to have any amount of credibility that mentions the guard at the tomb explicitly uses that story with apologetic intent.
If they say they stole the body, what are they assuming about the state of the tomb?
That it's empty.
That it's empty, right? You don't say to your teacher something like, my dog ate my homework, if you have your homework.
Once again, though, let's put this in its proper context. Paul doesn't say anything about a tomb, empty or otherwise. The first mention of a tomb shows up around 70 CE in Mark. Then there's at least a decade before the story of the guard at the tomb shows up, and when it finally does, it's explicitly being used to counter the claim that the disciples stole the body. What this suggests to me is that once the story of the empty tomb started becoming well known, people who doubted would ask how they could know that Jesus' disciples hadn't simply stolen the body, to which there would have been a variety of responses. So the author of Matthew either wrote down the one he was familiar with, or chose the one that he found to be most plausible, and then he explained right beside his explanation that the stolen body idea is still repeated to this day. What's more, the guard at the tomb is entirely implausible. Pilate, as we know from other ancient writings, was completely unsympathetic to the plight of the people that he was governing. Philo of Alexandria described him as being impeachable in respect of his corruption and his acts of insolence and his rapine and his habit of insulting people and his cruelty and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. I wonder when sentences that weren't run-on sentences were invented. That doesn't seem like the kind of guy that, for starters, would allow Jesus to be removed from the cross and put in a respectable tomb in the first place, but he definitely would not lend his own soldiers to guard that tomb after the fact.
So the first explanation from the religious leaders is the apostles stole the body, which shows that the body was gone and the tomb was empty.
We don't actually know what their first explanation was, or even if there was a first explanation. If Jesus was treated the same way as other crucifixion victims of the time, then it's most likely that neither the disciples nor the religious leaders knew where his body was. And given the complete lack of details about any tomb burial in Paul's writings, it appears as though the details about Jesus' burial were, at the very least, unimportant. This is, of course, an argument from silence. We can't conclude with 100% certainty that Paul's failure to mention a tomb means that Jesus was definitely not put in a tomb, but it's a cumulative case here. The norm was for crucifixion victims to be left hanging to rot, at which point they would be placed in unmarked graves or mass graves. There is evidence for the families of crucifixion victims being allowed to recover the bodies in one specific location and on specifically the day of the emperor's birthday, but the gospel story is that Joseph of Arimathea recovered Jesus' body body, not his family, and there's no indication that it was the emperor's birthday, so that exception doesn't apply here. But then, even if Joseph was allowed to recover the body for some reason, as a member of the council, he was bound by Jewish law to bury Jesus in a separate cemetery put aside for criminals, and Josephus Sanhedrin 9:8 even explicitly states that this is without exception, even if the criminal were the King of Kings. So, in order to believe that Jesus was buried in a tomb, we'd first have to ignore the descriptions of Pilate by all sources outside of the Bible, in order to believe that he cared enough about respecting Jewish customs to not leave bodies hanging on crosses during Passover or Sabbath. Then, Pilate would have to allow an exception for the typical burial of these people in order to hand his body over to Joseph of Arimathea, which would be a completely unprecedented exception, as Joseph was not Jesus' family. Then Joseph, a member of the Sanhedrin, would have had to break Sanhedrin law that explicitly forbids even the King of Kings from being buried in a family tomb if he dies as a criminal, by burying him in his family tomb. And to top it all off, we also have to ignore the complete lack of any reference to such extraordinary and unlikely events in the earliest documentation of Christianity that we have. Apologists will tell you that there is no one piece of bulletproof evidence that proves the resurrection. Rather, it's the cumulative case of these smaller, plausible pieces of evidence that, when taken together, make the resurrection more likely than not. Well, applying that same technique here, we find that Jesus' burial in a tomb is more unlikely than not. And not by a little bit.
Now, we could talk about whether or not it's reasonable for the apostles to steal their body, and I mainly think it's not reasonable because, number one, they had to get by the guard, but number two, why would they go out and willingly suffer and be willing to die for something if they stole a body and knew it was false?
Well, sure is a good thing that the sincerity of the apostles doesn't actually prove the resurrection in particular or Christianity in general. And don't take my word for it, here is none other than Sean McDowell himself saying exactly that.
You can't move from the sincerity of the apostles to the truth of the resurrection. I've never said that. I make it very clear in my book. In fact, at the very opening pages, that the apostles' willingness to suffer and die doesn't prove the resurrection in particular or Christianity in general.
Now, in fairness to Sean, he does go on to say that their sincerity is more of an argument against the idea that they just made stuff up, but then he does go on to say that this is part of the cumulative case thing that I mentioned earlier that does support the resurrection. So he's kind of doing a have your cake and eat it too thing here. That aside, I don't doubt the sincerity of whichever disciple first thought Jesus was resurrected. I find Pelagia's minimal witnesses hypothesis to be more than sufficient for explaining the origin of Christianity without an actual resurrection, and it only requires one or two people to have had a bereavement hallucination in order to get the ball rolling. Bereavement hallucinations are quite common, and they require no history of mental illness. They can happen to anybody, and as someone who has experienced such hallucinations myself, I can tell you that even though I was aware of the existence of such hallucinations, they are powerful enough that I found myself on more than one occasion wondering how I was going to explain to the various banks and government agencies why I sent them a death certificate for someone who was still alive. And I'm not talking about a momentary, oh shit, I shouldn't have sent that, followed immediately by my realization of what was happening. I'm talking about me spending sometimes half an hour rummaging through paperwork to compile a list of all the places I'd have to call to start sorting things out. I can only speculate here, but if that's how strong these things can be to someone who is fully aware of what they are, how much more convincing could they be to someone living in a time when even some of the most common disorders and diseases were believed to have supernatural causes, and who was already primed to believe that Jesus was going to come back from the dead? The idea that such an experience could cause a couple of disciples to sincerely believe that Jesus rose from the dead and then ascended into heaven is entirely plausible to me.
So I think when we start to piece some of these things together, there's reasons why some of the greatest journalists, greatest historians, greatest lawyers, and thinkers of all time have stopped and been like, wow, there's a powerful case that Jesus lived, died, buried, and appeared to people on the third day.
Was that an appeal to authority or an appeal to popularity? Either way, it doesn't matter. Many of the best mathematicians in history were Muslim. Many of the best philosophers of all time were the Greek polytheists. Others were Hindu, Buddhist, and Confucians. The case you have built here is so full of holes that any self-respecting lawyer wouldn't want to bring it before a judge. So if the case is actually good enough to convince the best lawyers ever, why don't you make that case? There's also, I suspect, a pretty good reason that most of the scholarship that supports any of the supernatural claims of the Bible comes from Christian institutions with Christian mission statements and often statements of faith that their employees must agree to adhere to or risk losing their jobs. Like, Mike Licona, New Testament scholar and professor of New Testament studies at Houston Christian University, was forced in 2011 to resign from his position as apologetics coordinator at North American Mission Board because he had the audacity to suggest that the Jerusalem zombie horde described in Matthew 27:52-53 might not have been meant to be taken as a literal event, instead being an apocalyptic symbol to communicate that the Son of God had just died. If such a minor disagreement can lose you your job, why do you think that these same scholars would be free to question the authenticity of the tomb, or the historicity of Joseph of Arimathea, or any number of completely unbelievable claims that the Bible makes? Most of the great thinkers you're referencing are people that had jobs that would require expertise in fields that are not even relevant to this question. Journalists, lawyers, and just general thinkers. Aside from the question of how one measures the greatness of these people, it is worth mentioning that someone who has expertise in one field is by no means an expert in all of the other fields. A lawyer may well be an excellent lawyer without knowing even the slightest detail about the evidence or lack thereof of Jesus' resurrection. And then, for journalists, I'd consider Brian Deere to be one of the greatest journalists of all time. But when you look into him, you don't find anything about religion one way or the other. Almost like that's not the focus of his career, and so his opinion on it is irrelevant. As to lawyers, the best lawyers won't even give you hints about their religious affiliation, as it's not relevant to their job. Their job is to make the best possible case for their client, whether that be at trial or preemptively by protecting their client with disclaimers, waivers, and advice. If I call up a lawyer and ask to retain their services for my atheist YouTube channel, their job is to help me structure things in a way that is best for me, not to examine my claims to see whether or not they agree with them. And as far as great thinkers are concerned, according to the 2020 Phil Paper survey of professional philosophers, nearly 67% of them accept or lean towards atheism, with only about 19% accepting or leaning towards theism. And it doesn't even specify what kind of theism, so it can be assumed that the percentage that actually find there to be a compelling case specifically for the resurrection of Jesus will be smaller than that. As to the historians, there's kind of a self-selecting bias when it comes to studying the life of Jesus. The people most likely to go into that specific field are more likely to be Christian, and while we certainly can't deny all of their work on the grounds that they had a priori beliefs that they are trying to prop up, we also can't ignore the fact that someone with an a priori belief in the resurrection is going to be less likely to conclude that the resurrection cannot be historically confirmed than someone who doesn't.
And isn't it true that it's not only in the Bible that we read about Jesus living, dying, being buried, and being seen after he died, but that's also attested to by non-Christian contemporary historians during that time?
Depends very much on what you consider to be attestation. Certainly, there is plenty of attestation to what Christians believed, but just saying these guys believed that Jesus rose from the dead is a very long way from Jesus actually rose from the dead.
So some of those facts, yes. Now, I know you're not implying this, but when skeptics say to me, well, what about outside the Bible? There's kind of an assumption that we can't trust the Bible.
I mean, yeah. The Bible is the claim, not the evidence. Sure, there are ways we can compare different books of the Bible that we have reason to believe were written independently from each other in order to try and parse out what may or may not be true, and we can certainly learn about the early church and some of its beliefs and practices from Paul's letters, but when the Bible says that Jesus rose from the dead, I'm not just going to believe that any more than I believe Suetonius when he wrote about the healing miracles of Emperor Vespasian, or the ancient effigy that soothsayers unearthed around the same time as the miracles that was in Vespasian's likeness. And Suetonius is generally agreed to have been an excellent historian. The authors of the Gospels, however, are completely unknown to us outside of their singular books, with the exception of the author of Luke also having written Acts.
I'm telling you, Kirk, if we had none of these other sources, I still think we can trust the accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and other early Christian historians to have confidence that it's true.
Strong disagree.
Yes, so do I.
With that said, when we go outside of the scriptures, you have writers like Josephus at the end of the first century that affirm the existence of Jesus.
And who's Josephus?
Josephus was a Jewish writer writing on behalf of the Romans in the 90s.
Not a Christian.
He was not a Christian, no.
And at most, what we can get from Josephus is that Jesus was a dude who lived and had a brother named James. Well, unless we want to pretend that the Testimonium Flavianum wasn't a Christian insertion into his work, as scholars universally agree. Sure, there is disagreement about just how much of it is a later insertion, but given the degree of disagreement, it's difficult to say how much information can really be gleaned from the Testimonium.
And so he gives basic facts. Jesus, the brother of James, Jesus lived, he was died, there's reports that he's the Messiah.
Now, let's be honest here, Sean. He didn't say that there were reports that he was the Messiah. He flat out said he was the Messiah. That's one of the ways we know there was Christian meddling with this passage. It is extremely implausible to think that Josephus, the Jewish historian working for the Romans, would just drop a line in his book about how Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, but then would not himself become a Christian. Of all the disagreement about which parts of the passage are Christian interpolations and which are not, the "he was a Messiah" line is probably the most agreed upon to not be authentic.
He doesn't give all the details, but he tells details that help support and corroborate the accounts within the Gospels.
And if I grant all the details that weren't obvious Christian interpolations, we wind up with the position that I usually hypothetically start my videos from anyway. Jesus was a guy who lived, gained a following, got on the Roman radar, and was executed by crucifixion. None of that is particularly impressive, which is why I'm perfectly comfortable granting it as the starting position. Your goal as the apologist is to move the needle, convince me to believe more than that. The non-biblical references to Jesus amount to nothing more than Christians are a group of people that exist. So you can bring out all the references you like and it won't move the needle because I never contested that Christians existed.
You get in the 2nd century, you have writers like Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, and he also points to the existence of Pontius Pilate, the death of Jesus, the persecution of early Christians.
Wait, are there people who doubt the existence of Pilate? I'm perfectly happy to point out that Pilate existed, but there are sources that confirm that show up much earlier than the 2nd century. Both Philo of Alexandria and Josephus attest not only to Pilate's existence, but also to some of his actions while in office. And those portrayals are quite different from the Pilate we find in the Bible. The Bible has him worried about offending Jewish sensibilities, trying desperately not to execute a guy that he thought was innocent, and only relenting to appease the Jewish leaders, all while making a big show of washing his hands of Jesus' death. The Pilate of Philo and Josephus, however, went out of his way to offend Jewish sensibilities, and only relented when chastised by the emperor himself. Philo explicitly stated that he would frequently execute people without even so much as a trial first, so the idea that he would be so wrought with guilt over being forced to execute someone he thought was innocent just doesn't track. Anyway, all this to say that if you consider an extra-biblical mention of Pilate to be confirming the events of the Bible, why are you skipping to Tacitus, writing in the 2nd century, rather than the two historians who were closest to the actual events? Is it because the content of those sources disagrees with the Bible? Are you picking and choosing by any chance?
You find these extra biblical sources. And by the way, there's not a ton of extra biblical sources on anything in that time period at that time.
What are you talking about? The 1st century Roman Empire is in the running for being one of the most well-documented periods of ancient history. Sure, there wasn't a lot coming specifically out of Judea, but historians were running amok in that time period.
So the fact that they would even talk about Jesus, who's a religious leader in a small corner of the empire that didn't have any political power anyways, is significant.
Not when you look at the context of their writing. Tacitus was talking about the people who Nero blamed for the fire. His mention of Jesus was purely to give background information on who these Christians that Nero blamed even are. In Josephus, the bit about Jesus is basically a footnote in his section about Pilate. He describes several instances of Pilate antagonizing the Jews, and then finishes it off with what amounts to, oh yeah, there was also this Jesus guy that Pilate had crucified, and even after he died, the religion began, made up of people who believed he rose from the dead, and they still exist to this day. And those are the two most impressive extra-biblical mentions of Jesus.
So there are some non-Christian sources that are relatively early that help strengthen the case that we're talking about.
And that's it. We're done. That was a rather large nothing burger. So yeah, nothing really new here. I was hopeful for a second when he said that Jesus being buried in Jerusalem was part of the evidence, but then that turned out to be a slight variation on the whole people could have easily verified the details of the story thing. Apologists love to do this thing where they suggest that there's a lot more stuff backing up the things they're saying, but then they all say the same small handful of things with a trust me bro guarantee that there really is more.
The trust me bro guarantee of quality.
But there never turns out to be. And what's more, there seems to be an effort to encourage misconceptions among believers. Two main examples stood out to me. First, when talking about the gospel authors inventing witnesses to the empty tomb, he phrased it in a way that would encourage the average layperson to conclude that the atheist position is that the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all working independently, and had each independently had the idea to invent women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb.
Who are the least likely witnesses they would invent, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to be persuasive? And the answer is they obviously wouldn't invent women.
This serves two purposes. First, it reinforces the misconception that all four Gospels were completely independent works, when at the very least the Synoptics were not. And second, it makes the atheist argument look more ridiculous than it is. Like, maybe one author might have invented an implausible first witness, but all four? Come on! Second, and this is, apparently I did nesting numbered lists here, so this is second back in the first numbered list, so I hope you had your pen and paper handy. So second, the whole "they wouldn't die for a lie" thing. In this video, he basically skips straight to, we know Jesus resurrected because they wouldn't die for a lie when he said this.
But number two, why would they go out and willingly suffer and be willing to die for something if they stole a body and knew it was false?
But from his debate with Apologia, we know that this is not a position that he holds. His is slightly more nuanced than that, with him mainly using the "they wouldn't die for a lie" thing to speak to their sincerity rather than the truth of the resurrection. But the way it's phrased in this presentation will leave the average layperson with the impression that the disciples' willingness to die for their beliefs is, in fact, evidence for the truth of their beliefs rather than merely the sincerity of their beliefs. Now, in Sean's case, I don't actually think that he's doing it intentionally. There were some other bits in here where he actually pushed back on Kirk Cameron's misconceptions. And from other videos that I've seen of him, he doesn't seem hesitant to talk about some of the aspects of the evidence for Christianity that other apologists tend to avoid or minimize because of how difficult they are to deal with. And I've seen him change his position when presented with new evidence. So whether these little bits that encourage misconceptions are unintentional, or whether he thinks the simplification to fit into a TV segment is justified, I don't think that he was doing it maliciously. But intentions be damned, the results are the same. The lay people wind up with misconceptions that could be easily avoided with some added nuance, but that nuance will be hard for many Christians to hear. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Ian Babineau 5340, who says, "That soy milk thing wasn't a mistake, but it may have led me to developing a new fetish." You know what? When I created my YouTube channel way back in the before times of 2016, I did not in my wildest imaginings think that I'd wind up helping people explore and discover new aspects of their sexualities. And while that's not my primary intention here, I'm totally here for it. If I hear too many more jokes about wanting me to start an OnlyFans, I might just wind up doing it. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the women who apologists think are the embarrassment to my channel. If you'd like me to actually be quite proud of you, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. That's right, if you want someone to be proud of you, just pay me money and I'll be proud of you for it. Or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO box address is in the description. See you next time! I would hesitate to give any credence to their account of the guard at the tomb as being credible. That's what giving credence means. The norm was for crucifixion victims to be left hanging to rot, and then when the norm was for crucifixion victims to be left hanging to rot, and then the norm was for crucifixion victims to be left hanging to rot when they would be then. The norm was for crucifixion victims to be left hanging to rot when they would then. The norm was for crucifixion victims to be left hanging to rot, and then would they. For fuck's sake. The norm was for crucifixion victims to be left hanging to rot when they would. At which point they would. Okay, at which point. Let's go with at which point. Rather, it's the cumulative case of smaller, plausible pieces of evolution. God damn it. And it only requires one or two people to have had a bereavement hallucination. Were Apostles Martyred video 2005 to 2003. What? Okay, the timestamp's wrong, but whatever. Fuck off. Put the clip here. When at the very least the Synoptics were not, and